Everybody, welcome. For those that don't know me, my name's Paul Reynolds. I'm the current chair of the Urban Design Group, and I'm the host for today's final one of our masterclass sessions, covering the various topics from last year's awards. If this is your first one, you can catch up on the previous ones on the Urban Nous website. I think they're all up there now, and this one will be added in due course. So there's a chance there to go back and have a look at the other categories and see the shortlisted entries and hear from the winners. Today we are focusing on the policy, strategy and design guidance category. We've got the three shortlisted presentations coming up. So that's the Reardon Smith Landscapes Hostile Vehicle Mitigation project, Hackney's Growing Up in Hackney Child-Friendly Places, and the Masterplanning Stations by Weston Williamson partners. I want to start by just thanking the judges on this category. Sort of the UDG Awards is very much a voluntary effort, and we rely on the judges and the hard work they put in, both in terms of doing shortlisting and also the final judging. So a big thank you to them, and a sort of shout out to anyone who's interested in helping with judging going forward. We're sort of soon going to be getting ready for the next round of awards. So if anyone's interested in being on a judging panel, please do drop an email to the UDG office, and we may well be back in touch. So the format for today is we'll have a presentation by each of the shortlisted entries, about 10 minutes or so. We'll then have some time for a quick Q&A, similar length of time. So if you've got any questions, please feel free to either put them in the chat or to raise a hand, and I'll come to you at the end if you'd like to ask the question yourself. And then once we've been through all three presentations, I will announce the winner of the category, and give you a bit of background as to why the judges picked that entry as the winner. So without further ado, I'll hand over to, I think, what we've got first, the Reardon Smith Landscape Hostile Vehicle Mitigation.
So good afternoon, all. My name is Ed Freeman. I'm Principal Partner at Reardon Smith Landscape, and I'm here to talk to you about the third edition of the Public Realm Design Guide for Hostile Vehicle Mitigation, which was commissioned by the National Protective Security Authority, or NPSA, and they were previously called CPNI. I'm joined by Dr. Aoife Hunt, Director and Market Lead at Movement Strategies, a GHD company, and she'll be talking about their innovative research and crowd science that supported the development of this guide. NPSA is the UK government's national technical authority for physical and personal security. Their role is to protect UK's critical assets, interests and people, countering threats such as terrorism, espionage and sabotage by creating advice, tools and guidance for professionals. The current national threat level is substantial, which means a terrorist attack is likely. One way terrorists attack people is using vehicles. They are easy to acquire and use and can cause mass injuries and fatalities in busy places. It has become a popular method of attack for terrorists in recent years, and there are thousands of potential targets in the UK. This means hostile vehicle mitigation, or HVM, remains as important as ever. Historically, NPSA's guidance was technically focused and text-heavy, not ideally suited for the creative profession. Significant parts were also classified and often communicated solely through security professionals, with external designers only informed on a need-to-know basis. This was a flawed approach that stifled awareness and limited innovation. NPSA recognised the need to have closer links with the professionals who sit outside of security, responsible for designing, delivering and managing public spaces to inspire the art of the impossible, incorporating HVM within public spaces. There are several key changes in this latest edition of the guide. One is that the guide places a greater emphasis on the protection of people rather than assets such as buildings, which is in response to new emerging threats and terrorist techniques. The guide also considers risk management as addressed in UK government's emerging Martin's Law, previously known as the Protect Duty. This update also presented the opportunity to refresh the graphic design and improve accessibility and coordinate with other updated guidance. The key overarching message of the guide is to encourage creative thinking, underpinned by a clear understanding of the technical requirements for hostile vehicle mitigation, with an emphasis on a design approach that is site-specific and proportionate to the risk. As part of a collaborative consultation process, we selected a steering group of professionals, designers and leading thinkers to join us to test, challenge and inform the development of the guidance, with the aim of making the guide as relevant as it can be to design professionals and their clients. We are delighted that the Public Realm Design Guide has received the endorsement of many of these key organisations you can see on screen, many of which were represented on the steering group. These endorsements are key to encourage the use of this guide, and we are about to commence a series of nationwide seminars to disseminate the guide amongst the professional community. The guide itself is set out in 7 parts, designed with colour coding for ease of navigation. And the intention has been to make this a largely visual document to appeal to the creative profession and to demonstrate technical concepts in clear graphical style. Accessibility is also improved with larger font size, black text on white background, and the use of alt text for visually impaired. The digital document also has an interactive menu bar, bookmarks for ease of navigation, and hyperlinks to other supporting technical information. Part 1, Context, provides information on the methods of vehicle-borne attack, different techniques of terrorists, and gives an overview of different HVM measures. One key message in this context is every metre counts, which highlights the increase in distance between people or asset and threat vehicle provides a reduction in damage. This section also explains the difference between active, passive and temporary vehicle security barriers. One of the main purposes of the guide is to provide inspiration for creative responses that provide multiple benefits for the public realm. Part 2, Pre-Design, discusses risk, how designers and organisations can assess risk and make informed decisions about the management of risk. To assist with these tasks, links are provided to detailed guidance on the risk management process and for developing a project security plan, amongst others. It's important to identify stakeholders and encourage stakeholder engagement at the outset of a project so all can work together until residual risks are reduced to as low as reasonably practical. Successful security is most effective when a layered approach is taken from the outer district to the threshold and finally to the site itself. Each of these have different constraints and opportunities, and the design considerations and potential opportunities for each of these layers are illustrated later in the part 5 of the guide. HVM can also provide a number of benefits to an area: public reassurance, reducing antisocial behaviour and crime, reducing vehicle speeds and improving road safety, reductions in air and noise pollution, and opportunities for artistic features and increased biodiversity through greening. I'll now pass over to Aoife to present a new section of the guide which offers advice on pedestrian flows and the consideration of pedestrian movement.
Thanks, Ed, and hello, everyone. Good afternoon. So as Ed has said, the Public Realm Design Guide has a new and extended section on accessibility and people movement. And this is based on the latest research into people movement and behaviour, or what we call the 5 Cs. So in a moment, we'll look at the 4 shown here in a bubble: capacity, convenience, comfort, and conflict. But let's start with the overarching C, context. Now, this means considering the social, situational, and demographic factors that influence people's behaviour and how they'll use a space. So thinking about context, will the barriers be near a station with people arriving and leaving in large waves? Or is it a place outside a gallery where people will meet and dwell? Is there a hot dog stand that's going to have a big queue, or other features that's going to change how people circulate? Is it a space where people will be familiar and know where they're going, or will it be tourists navigating for the first time? Will people be carrying bags and using bikes, prams, and mobility equipment? All of this context impacts the other Cs. So let's have a look in a bit more detail. So considering capacity, we look at this as how many people can flow through the urban space once these types of obstacles are in the way. And looking at the top left diagram there, you can see that there's a line of bollards here. One's perpendicular to flow and one's at a diagonal. If you're approaching a bollard line head on, you have lots of space with which to move. But actually, if it's at a diagonal slant, the usable space for people using it from that direction is a bit lower. So this guide provides information on how to calculate the capacity of these sort of features. Moving on to convenience, so bottom left here, considering how people will want to use the design and whether the infrastructure supports or hinders them. And in this example, everyone's trying to move from the bottom up to the top, which means it sort of doesn't matter what kind of barriers in the way. But if we look at the top right, where people are moving from left to right, the impact on their comfort is palpable. And comfort is considered here as how much personal space would be available for everyone to circulate and dwell. So if you're positioning obstacles in the public realm, what that means for people's ability to stand, how close they can stand to that infrastructure and to each other will impact their comfort. And finally, looking at conflicts. So if you consider the desire lines of people and where they're moving to, will the design increase or decrease the potential for conflict between people or between people and structures within the design? And in this example, where there's a distinct crossflow where conflict will occur, that positioning of barriers would not be advisable. The guide also looks at the technical requirements for design, so including the space needed to accommodate different user groups and those requiring mobility assistance. And finally, it looks at the types of tools and methods that can be used to support planning. Here's an example of a micro-simulation model that can test how different types of barriers will operate in large crowd footfall. This was for a stadium, but could also be applied to a busy station or other types of areas with high footfall. And there are lots of other methods out there to assess people movement and behaviour through urban design. So this section in the Public Realm Design Guide really advocates a people-centric approach where behaviours and preferences and social context is considered as a core part of the design process. Back to you, Ed.
Thank you, Aoife. So yes, part 3 also provides technical requirements, as Aoife was mentioning, for the detail of VSB elements to allow designers to provide creative solutions based on the security requirements. This information is based on extensive research and crash testing at the Transport Research Laboratory. Part 4, Design Inspiration, looks at the principles for design of HVM. Whilst the site-specific response is essential, there are 6 principles shown on the screen for the successful delivery of integrated solutions. The images shown to the right provide examples of techniques and features which could be adapted to provide HVM, as well as a number of other benefits such as water play, seating, level changes, urban greening, SUDs, and traffic calming measures. The guide also provides 3 urban scenarios to illustrate potential strategies for each of the geographic layers of district, threshold and site. District is on screen at the moment. At the wider district level, controls can be implemented at a range of scales for maximum effect. Strategies to reduce the ability of hostile vehicles to access an area and reduce their speed can involve site planning, traffic management and control of vehicle access. Whilst measures have the potential to provide wider benefits from multiple assets, they should also avoid the risk of displacing vulnerabilities elsewhere. Part 6 process provides a reference for studies and assessments to be undertaken and actions to be considered at each of the key work stages. And stages include preparation and briefing, concept and technical design, completion and in use. And Part 7 appendices provides links to other organisations and technical guidance. There's also precedent images of HVM measures or features that have the potential to be adapted as required to provide HVM, covering a variety of urban contexts. The locations of each precedent are also listed to allow self-guided visits for research. I hope this overview of the Public Realm Design Guide was informative, and we would encourage all of you to visit NPSA's website to view and download the full guide. I would just like to end by saying that this guide has the ability to save people's lives, and we welcome your support to create a safe, resilient and sustainable public realm for all. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Eve. That was really interesting. Okay, just to reassure, if anyone's got any questions, please do put your hands up, put them in the chat. We have one question in the chat already. It's quite an interesting question, I think, actually. It says, is personal space an absolute, or does it vary across different cultures?
This is a great question, whoever put this in the chat, absolutely. So personal space is not an absolute. Absolutely, cultural differences will mean that some people want less opportunity for physical contact than others, as I'm sure you can imagine. But this idea of social distance and how close we want to be to other people, you know, it's not related to the pandemic. We've always had certain preferences for how close we want to be to other people. And what's interesting is that even for the same person, that will change. So have a think about it. Think about how close you would be willing to stand next to someone on a crush-loaded train if you really had to get into work or to where you were going. You wouldn't feel comfortable standing that close to people in a workplace, in a shopping street. So it's different. It's different if you're in a lift. It's different if you're walking and shopping. It's different if you're dwelling. Even things like queues, people will stand much more closely to people if they're waiting in a toilet queue than they would in other scenarios. So it's not an absolute, but the beauty of the latest research is that we can quantify this. We can say, right, in these sort of environments, people are likely to want this much space, and then accommodate for that in design.
Thank you. A slight follow-up question from me, actually, is how does the speed of people affect it as well? Because I just know from personal experience that if you're at, say, a football match and everyone's moving very slowly between bollards, it feels very different to when maybe you're walking quite fast down the street and there's some obstruction to it. Is sort of the speed of movement have an impact on this as well?
Absolutely. And Paul, look, I could nerd out about this for 2 hours and I won't. But speed and flow are related. So we all have a personal preference, how quickly we want to walk, and how quickly we're trying to walk. And then depending on how many people around us will define whether we can actually reach that preferred speed. And the flow of people, particularly your example there in football, through bollards is related to how quickly people walk and how dense the crowd is around them. But you can put a number to that. And actually the research that's been conducted for this guide has been able to put some figures to how many people per minute you could expect to get through those spaces when they're very busy. But back to that brilliant question from earlier, how people's personal preferences will come into it as well. But happily, we can put those numbers in.
Okay, great, thank you. We've got another question. How do the sites get defined? I worked on a scheme that I felt was ruined by the need for a huge protective line of bollards, and it ruined the public realm, in my opinion. Does the guide help to find the likelihood of risk? Actually, I'd link to that. I'll just say I had a question as well, which is just to understand maybe a bit about the status of the document and kind of, how do you use it, or who's it kind of targeted at, I suppose.
I mean, it's targeted for the whole industry, especially people who are involved in designing. So that's all the way down up from the top of the owner, the client, all the way down to the design team, operators, local council, etc. So it's really wide ranging. This is trying to reach the whole of the industry to address the needs of security and risk assessment at an earlier stage. I think we've all, not all, but I've certainly worked on projects in the past where security was an add-on at the end. And picking up Paul Murray's comment there with regards to a huge line of protective bollards, it's such a shame. It's such a shame seeing that. Now, bollards are okay in certain situations, but we want to have creative responses, and this guide is trying to encourage creative responses. It's not just about going and having a line of bollards. You can create safer spaces and actually create an improved public realm through the actual layout of the design elements you're putting in there. And there's creating opportunities for street tree planting and suds, etc. So this shouldn't be seen as a hampering element. It should be seen as just another thing that we have to deal with and consider at an early stage. The site, how do the sites get defined? Well, there's a risk assessment element within the design guide, so you can find more information on that. And in fact, the RIBA stages or plan of work, they've recently done an overlay with MPSA to guide people on the sort of key elements you have to address as you go through design stages. But effectively, everywhere in the public realm potentially could be at risk. So this is there are thousands of areas where people are at risk, and it needs to be considered. And if I had time, I was going to show a demonstration, a worked example, but it's really annoying. I had to take the slides out at the last minute because we run over the 10 minutes allocated. But it would have actually helped answer that question of what you're considering, where you're considering it, and the opportunities actually that could be presented through the requirement of security.
I think that's probably answered. So there's another question there about defining what level of protection is required. But I guess that's, again, it's kind of, all schemes have a look at the book and then go through the process, and it will help to define what's required based on the risk, etc. that's set out. A couple of people are asking kind of similar questions here around the use of trees in place of bollards or interspersed with bollards, and kind of, how you mentioned it briefly there, Ed, but kind of how maybe natural planting can be used rather than physical objects, be that bollards or seats or something.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting topic and suggestion. I think it would be great if trees could be relied upon to provide that security. As a landscape architect, I'm a great supporter of green infrastructure. I think that is being considered, but it's in an early stage. I think trees can be incorporated within a scheme that incorporates HVM by creating space for street tree planting. We all know we don't like trees stuck in planters that has a limited life, so it's best to plant them in the ground. So there is a variety of different ways of doing that, but perhaps through the arrangement of street furniture and the arrangement of the design of the public space, it actually allows you to get some street tree planting whilst also protecting a space through other elements. So that's how I would respond to that one.
Okay. Another question here around the design of the HVM elements in terms of the need for having things that look nice and hiding them versus the kind of desire to have more permeable objects, i.e. sort of bollards versus maybe a linear bench, which might look better but is more of an obstruction to movement. Is there sort of guidance in the document around that in terms of which are the best approaches?
Well, yes, there is, and I think there's no one response. Yeah, everything has to be site specific, so it's something to consider as you're designing the space. Whether or not you don't just have security as an add-on, it is part and parcel of a wider consideration of microclimate, of levels, of views, of movement corridors, of places to dwell. So it needs to be considered not just as a separate sort of add-on, but also part of the toolkit of items that you can. There's a toolkit within this design guide. It wasn't one of the slides, but it shows you different ways of doing things to provide designers creativity in protecting people.
Okay. And then one final question, operations and maintenance, is that something that's covered in the guide in terms of obviously the need to look after these measures?
Yes, absolutely, and it's a really good question. It's part of the security overlay and also part of the process page. I think it's part 6, and that goes through not just pre-design and stakeholder engagement, not just designing the elements themselves, but it also considers completion and in use. And again, if I had more time, and we are running a series of seminars that will be about an hour-ish long, and you'll get all this information. But yes, with regards to maintenance, operation, O&M manuals, that is something that has to be considered. And threats change as well. The design guide this is the 3rd edition, and it's been in response to terrorist threats, the changing methods of terrorists. And so things will change, and we have to have flexible public realm to allow for that. So,
right. Okay. Thank you. All right. Well, I think it's a really interesting topic. Certainly, in my past professional experience, I've been involved in schemes that relate to HVM. So maybe it's one that we can look to have an event on in future.
Great.
Right. We're going to move on. Thank you. Our next presentation is by Weston, Williamson and Partners on their Masterplanning in Stations project. I'm not sure who's leading that. Is that Max? Is that over to you?
Hi, well, thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for having us. I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that's just loading up now. Yeah, hopefully that's now visible.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
So we're going to talk about our master planning at stations design guide today, and how that sort of works and can be used by a sort of range of parties and users. So I'm going to cover sort of what manual is, how we worked on it, sort of who we are, and sort of how it fits into the wider Network Rail design manual project, the audience of the document and its purpose, then a bit about how we've developed it, and then I'll go on to the content of the manual before an opportunity for questions and discussion. So yeah, just to introduce myself, I'm Max Breese. I'm Associate Architect at Weston Williamson, and I worked on this alongside our master planning team. I've got a stations background, and I've also worked with Network Rail on a series of guidance documents. Just to sort of introduce, I've got Tom Marshall from Gerald, who worked closely with us, who's going to be talking in a bit about business case and viability. And he worked sort of very closely with us on the manual, alongside Aoife as well, helped with infrastructure and implementation. We worked with sort of a kind of very enlightened sort of client at Network Rail, their technical authority, and they've sort of been on this project to developing new design guidance. So it's quite a sort of tight group client side, but we also had a much wider stakeholder group, bringing on all the expertise at Network Rail from their station and asset teams through to development teams, the regions, the project sponsor teams. And then we also worked with local authorities on how this document could help them, how it could help their projects. And we also sort of spoke with developers. We met with the design council. We had designers on board, and then we sort of varied that working group as the project went on, to bring in sort of a range of expertise at different stages and for different parts of the manual. So this sort of sits as part of a wider suite, and sort of the aim of the suite really is to take Network Rail's principles of good design and then help sort of range of users from designers, stakeholders, client teams implement that, understand that, and then explains how standards can be implemented. The whole purpose of the suite is that it's accessible, it's engaging, it's informative, it can be sort of easily interpreted by a range of users and sort of readily implemented on projects. And it's part of, so as mentioned, a wider project that goes from strategic planning documents such as this one through to design manuals for specific elements of stations, through to compliance manuals. And as this project's gone on, the sort of number of manuals has grown as there's been requests from users for extra topics to be covered, and this has been sort of a rolling program where there's been some great feedback on the documents as they continue to develop. Just to sort of share some of the other documents we've been involved in, we've been involved in station design guidance, inclusive design, heritage, vertical circulation, to name a few, and there's other sort of a much wider suite. The kind of key focus on all the documents is to make them really informative, to provide examples throughout them, to give case studies that users can follow so they can then sort of see how it relates to their project, making the advice sort of suitable to a range of projects and a range of scenarios rather than a sort of one size fits all. So for this document specifically, the audience for this document is project managers, sponsors, design teams, heritage groups, the train operating companies, but sort of on a broader level, it's there for local authorities, and it's there for developers, owners, investors, people that might not be used to engaging with Network Rail, people that may not know some of the sort of technical challenges of a station. It really helps sort of unpick that, and that it helps them understand sort of what the requirements for a station master plan is and how they can sort of successfully work with that. How it assists users, so it helps them identify the needs of their project, and it supports them with developing a brief. It works through the different stages, working out who the stakeholders are, what the different steps are of a master planning project, helps them develop a business case. It helps explain how and when they'll need to work with Network Rail and sort of how they can facilitate that discussion. And then it gives them a range of examples and projects that they can draw upon. I'm just going to hand over to Tom now to talk about.
Thanks, Max. Yeah, very good afternoon and very good to see you all. So just one other point on the slide above. I mean, I think it's important to recognise that whilst this was developed by Network Rail, it's now a common resource, and it's very much for the private sector. So whether it's investors, developers, landowners to use, and it's interesting that it's already starting to find its way into development briefs. So there's that common language that is aligned across all parties. In terms of how we've Sorry, Max. Just in terms of how we've actually communicated this to some of the key stakeholders from the public sector side. So Max and I have led presentations to the NR groups and the various stakeholders that were flagged above. We've also led learning sessions with DFT and some of the organisations associated, including HS2. So there's been a lot of learning sessions and roadshows to help promote this, and of course to the private sector clients as well. We've been sharing it with some of our key clients across the private sector as well.
So to touch on how we developed this project, we developed with Network Rail an idea of what the manual might contain, but then we met with sort of a group of stakeholders, and that sort of group grew and varied depending on the content of the document. So the aim was to have very sort of open collaborative discussions where we not only discussed what the document might contain, but the level of detail it would go into, what people would expect, what would be useful for them, then the kind of prioritization of that in the document. We sort of led very open discussions where people could bring good examples of good practice or particular challenges they faced, and we could see how the document might help with that. So as part of a kind of sort of wider open process with the stakeholders, we have conversations to the side about specific elements, test bits of the document as we developed it with them, so that it wasn't just kind of everything taking place in the room. People wanted to ask questions or they wanted to follow up outside the workshop, we'd do that. And then we'd then come back to certain topics in following workshops where, there was a range of different views or there wasn't kind of one size fits all approach. And so this happened over the course of about 8 workshops. And then as the document draft began to develop, we then shared the progress document with them for them to review and comment and see whether it met their needs as users. Just to talk about how the document set out. It's set out really on the basis of how a project will progress from understanding the purpose of the project, which it's trying to achieve, help people work out their success factors, through to sort of developing a brief. And it then goes on to sort of the more implementation side of the project, how you start developing the project, developing the options, developing viability, through to understanding the specific spatial needs, and then how you might implement that based on how you keep the master plan open over a longer period of time, how you might update it, how you might allow for phasing, how you might allow for future technology and future sort of development needs to be brought in. The document then gives some example toolkits on sort of theoretical projects, and then gives some examples of real projects, and then helps guide users to broader guidance both within Network Rail and nationally. So just some examples of how the document set out. We've really tried to keep it sort of open and engaging. We've set out where different users from clients and stakeholders through to design teams would sort of input and use different parts of the document. And we give examples and case studies as we go through the document. So we set out at the beginning how users would develop their master plan, what they're trying to achieve, what their case for change is, and how they would then develop that into their aspirations, how stakeholders would feed into that, through to how they might apply for funding. It then goes through to helping people define kind of the requirements for their master plan, looking at their governance structure, identifying how they might procure it and develop a brief. And it then goes through to the process of developing the master plan and then implementing it, explaining kind of the different touch points as you go through. We talk about the different needs of a station master plan and really try to explain to users that aren't necessarily used to a rail environment what the sort of technical challenges are of a station, the wider sphere of influences in terms of interchange, multimodal, bus, and what the purpose of a station public realm is, not necessarily for station users, but for the broader area. We then talk about what the needs of a master plan and what different development needs are, and then sort of the broader areas and how the station can have an influence on the wider area. We talk about sort of the need for master planning at stations, the importance of connecting a station with its environment, opening opportunities for growth, breaking down some of the barriers that often exist with stations where they really do cut through areas and sometimes disconnect areas, and how the station and the wider station master plan can connect and open up multimodal travel. We talk about the different stakeholders of a project, and we talk about how you could develop your stakeholder matrix, when you might engage with different stakeholders at different stages of the project, how you might do that, and how you might develop that specific need for your project. We then go on to give some examples of what a requirement might be for a project and what some of the issues, the problem the project is trying to tackle are. So the idea is that users might go through and be able to relate to some of these, or use this as a way to sort of unpick their own specific issues by looking at these examples. We then help people understand sort of what the extent of their master plan is. Like, you get certain station master plans that are very focused on the station, a sort of inside out approach, and are looking at areas around sort of station ownership and unpicking station challenges. Ones that develop much wider areas around potential development plots, maybe areas of rail use that are being disposed of, or other areas adjacent to the railway. Then through to much wider, more holistic master plans along the rail corridor, along a wider area. And we help users understand what the specific challenges of their project are and how they might challenge the boundary, both from a client perspective or from a designer or developer perspective, if there's something in place that doesn't match with the emerging needs of the project. We then help users understand what their vision is and how they might develop that vision, how they might bring the other parties along to that journey, incorporating the needs of the stakeholders into the vision, and how they can identify and align the different stakeholder needs so that there is one holistic aligned vision. It then talks about how that vision then feeds into the business case and how that can be kept alive and sort of referred to throughout the project, you know, to then check the project, making sure it's achieving what it set out to, and then helping develop KPIs and other methods to ensure the project remains on track and achieves what it sets out to. We explain the different sort of spatial and technical challenges of a master plan, of a station and station master plan, and what the different operational needs are for a railway, particularly for users that are coming to this document without a sort of railway background, so they can understand, you know, exactly how they can develop a master plan without precluding both the function and needs of the station, both in the sort of current time frame and in the future, when the station may be growing, may be developing, may have its own needs that need to be taken into consideration and developed as part of the master plan. Tom, do you want to talk about the optioneering?
Yeah, so this is a very practical guidance, and I think this is the value of a document like this, because, you know, anyone can look at this. There's worked examples as Max described, and when we talk about things like optioneering, you know, how you begin to shortlist, how you look at a sort of do minimum scenario or a do maximum scenario, and everything in between. It talks about the sort of criteria that you could use to go through that shortlisting exercise. And if you move to the next slide, please, Max. And a key part of that is obviously value creation, and we talk about value in the broadest sense, but in terms of revenue, there's worked examples and descriptions of how you can actually appraise the value of land, so viability testing, but also thinking about cash flows when you're looking at the various different interventions that may be required. So the investment ask that could be from the actual station requirements, but the wider infrastructure, and then how that's actually funded and how you begin to balance all of those different activities together. And if you can move on to the next slide, please, Max. And then creating the value through the realization of the land. So whether it's oversight development or adjacent site development or station development, you know, what are the various different value capture or value creation or value realization mechanisms that, from the public sector perspective, if it's Network Rail or another public sector body, you know, what are the various mechanisms that they can go through, whether it's an upfront land sale all the way through to some form of joint venture, and again using examples to describe how some of those could actually work in practice. So it's a very usable, and as you can see, a very visual document as well. Next slide, please, Max. And then, of course, once you've understood the value creation opportunity and the intervention that you want to focus on based on that shortlisting exercise, it describes the business case process. So looking at the 5 dimensions that are set out in the Green Book, thinking about the theory of change, and thinking about whether it's a transport-led business case or a regeneration-led business case, which focuses on homes and jobs, and how those different elements come together, firstly through an SOBC or a strategic outline business case, all the way through to a full business case. So it very much sets out each of those stages for anyone to review and to benefit from. Max.
And then lastly, we end with a toolkit section that gives an example of a station master plan around a theoretical place that unpicks a lot of the challenges that are covered in the document. It starts off with a project which has got sort of a lot of disused parts of the station sidings, poor connectivity, poor entrance, poor accessibility and interchange, and then looks at how all of those station issues can be unpicked, along with giving opportunity, redundant land, open for development around the station. And just lastly, I'd sort of welcome everyone to go and have a look at the document. If you sort of search online for Network Rail Station design guidance, you'll then get the full design guidance suite, and the document is there under master planning. The document's been made interactive with hyperlinks, and there's also an accessible version available online with prompts and with description of all the images for those that need that. So yeah, thanks very much for giving us this opportunity to share the document. We'd like to invite any questions and discussion.
Thanks, Max. Really interesting. Yeah, really interesting document, or suite of documents, I suppose, really, that you've been involved in. We've got one question in the chat so far, which it's an interesting one. It's similar to one I'd written down, actually, which was they said, I've been involved in station redevelopment. There was a struggle because one size fits all approach to station design features. How much flex for context and scale is there within the guide?
In terms of context, it covers sort of different spheres of influence around the project, from ones that are really kind of tight focused around the station through to much wider areas. And it really explains that there are different needs in certain projects. There'll be challenges that go further along the rail corridor or further along an area, whereas others will be, in a much more tight context, really kind of focused around the station. We also set out on a scale against DFT's different station categorization, the different needs of a station project, ranging from the smallest sort of category F station, an unstaffed small station, through to the largest stations in the country, and what their extra needs are. So users can sort of simply see some of those extra levels of detail or extra levels of provision that would be needed at a larger station, say, compared to a medium station, and they can then sort of help to develop their brief on that basis.
Okay, I mean, specifically from a local context, obviously there's a lot on the kind of agenda at the moment around beauty, etc. Is there kind of scope for those differing kind of architectural styles and materiality and all that sort of level of local context in terms of the design of buildings?
In terms of this document, we try to be very prescriptive around what's needed in terms of design, and it really comes back to the basis of speaking with the stakeholders, finding out and developing something that's true to the place and meets the needs of that place, rather than taking a predetermined or general approach.
Right, any more questions, or put anything in the chat, or anyone want to ask a question? Feel free to put your hand up if you've got a question you want to ask. While people are having a think, I might just ask how, I suppose, from a kind of point of view of the flexibility. I know sort of, over the 20 odd years that I've been in practice, there's sort of been so many shifts and changes in the way that rail in particular, I guess, is the kind of demand. So you sort of go through these periods where suddenly no one's traveling by trains anymore and everything's getting smaller, and then suddenly everyone's back on trains and demand is, massive and everything needs upgrading. How has this kind of got, I suppose, that future proofing built into it, and obviously a kind of system whereby we have the Network Rail infrastructure and the train operating companies doing some works and other things. So sort of how does it flex to allow those sort of changes within the system?
But what it does is it tries to help users sort of identify, along with Network Ground counterparts, what the future needs of a station might be, so that things can be protected and built into the scheme that might not necessarily be there on day one, but might be there sort of in 10 years' time. These projects aren't quick projects, so it recognised throughout it the need to sort of challenge the brief and keep checking it as the project goes on, because what we don't want to advocate for is a project that sort of developed sort of almost set in stone and then implemented 10 years later when needs have changed. It explains in the document how the master plan can be refreshed, brought up to date, challenged against kind of, not just emerging requirements, but emerging needs. We've started developing this during the sort of tail end of COVID. So we're very mindful as we're developing it, even over that sort of short period, needs felt like they were changing very quickly. And it sort of sets out that process that users can kind of continually check what they need. And also make sure if they don't need something now, they're not precluding future needs.
And just to add to that as well, Paul, because I think what this does, it looks at the scale of the opportunity in the broader sense. So I think the biggest risk is if you start off with a very narrow brief, and of course everyone needs to work to a brief that's clearly defined. But what it does, it looks at the scale of the opportunity around there and really considering what the red line should be. From our perspective, one of the key areas which often causes sterilisation is where you allocate areas for car parking, etc. So it's really thinking about how all of those different uses can come together in the short and in the longer term to create the broadest value.
Got a couple more questions. First one, is densification advocated for in the guide?
We talk about opportunities for so densification along the rail corridor, or around the wider area of the master plan. I mean, in those areas, it very much sort of advocates of what the needs are for the local community and the local planning needs. So it's not advocating densification, it's just sort of advocating design that's appropriate for the surroundings and meets local needs.
Okay.
And in many respects as well, it's the development that helps to pay for some of those interventions as well. So where appropriate, as Max says, in context is everything, but where appropriate, that development is an important function, or can be an important function.
Yeah, okay. The next one then is around any associated guidance for station interchange areas relating to best practice in terms of proximity to bus interchanges, taxis, parking, cycle hubs, etc. I guess that's kind of all covered. Certainly the slide on the screen at the moment suggests that those sort of interchanges and proximities are covered in the guidance.
Yeah, well, being part of a wider suite of documents, this talks about what that means in terms of master plan and how to allow for that and provide for it. There's also a public realm document that's come out as part of this suite, which the document refers to, and it's sort of it's several points across the document, points to other documents in the suite that go into more detail on specific requirements, station capacity being another one. This document sort of sets out how you could develop and meet the needs of a station, but it doesn't go into sort of some of those specifics. It points you to those. So really you find your way into the suite. In this case, it might be an external developer coming in looking at master plan, but it'll then set them where they can find out more about interchange, where they can find out more about sizing and provision.
One more question. Who is the guide designed? Who is the guide intended to influence, inspire most of all? Who are the key decision makers, and who can actually instruct based on the advice set out in the guide?
There's probably two aspects to that. One is people that are commissioning master plans or developing master plans. That might be both internally to Network Rail or sort of the public realm, or it might be external, so developers and teams that have got projects they want to carry out near stations that don't necessarily understand all of the station requirements or how to engage with Network Rail. So it helps people understand how they can develop their project with Network Rail as a partner. And then the other side of the document is how design teams can carry out a successful master plan, how designs can be reviewed, how options can be analysed, how business cases can be developed.
Right. Any more questions? Last chance before we move on. And so now on to the third presentation of our shortlisted schemes, which is from London Borough of Hackney. And this is a presentation of their Growing Up in Hackney Child-Friendly Places, SPD, being presented by Lizzie Bird. Over to you, Lizzie.
Great. Thank you. Thanks very much, Paul. Really pleased to be here today to talk through Hackney's guidance, which is Growing Up in Hackney, Hackney Child-Friendly Places guidance. I'm going to give a kind of quick 8 to 10 minute overview of the project. My name's Lizzie Bird, and I work in the strategic planning team at the London Borough of Hackney and have been involved over the last few years in developing the guidance, which was adopted in July 2021. So we're 2 years on from the guidance being in place as well. So I'm going to talk a bit about the process around how we prepared the guidance, give a bit of an overview about what's in it, and then also how we're using it in the borough at the moment. So just a kind of bit of context, Hackney is one of London's 33 London boroughs and is hugely diverse in terms of people and place. And in 2018, Hackney Council made a commitment to develop for Hackney to be a child-friendly borough, and this guidance is part of that. And what's really kind of setting the basis of it is children are a kind of indicator species. If we can build a successful city for children, we will have a successful city for all people. And in 2018-19, there was a piece of work done called Hackney Young Futures Commission, which asked young people in Hackney between the ages of 10 and 25 4 questions about the issues that they were facing and what they would do to overcome them. And the Hackney Young Futures Commission was a youth-led piece of work, and which spoke to around 2,400 young people in Hackney, and it identified kind of a range of different issues, and some of those related to the built environment, and recommendations came out of that. And it was on the kind of that formed the foundation of the design guidance that we developed. And then we were also at this time aware of kind of a range of different guidance around planning, urban design, and children and young people, particularly at kind of international, national, and also regional guidance. And really kind of the challenge for us was to take that and look at what we could actually do in terms of putting in place policy and design guidance to actually make sure that what development that came forward in the borough really reflected those principles. And I think just to say that the SPD really had a kind of we wanted to make sure that it had weight in the decision-making process in terms of planning applications. And when it was adopted in July 2021, it has stated as a supplementary planning document which supports our local plan, and particularly policies around social and community infrastructure, health and wellbeing, livable neighbourhoods, new open space, and place-based. And I'm going to talk a bit about sort of what's in the guidance, and then how we're using it. So just to say the six parts of the child-friendly places guidance. The first 2 parts look at providing kind of the context, look at the kind of policy and the research, and really kind of the foundations of the SPD. And then part 3 of the guidance looks at setting out Hackney's child-friendly principles for the built environment. And then part 4 looks at how, in practical design terms, what guidelines would deliver these, and looks at 3 different scales, which I'll talk a little bit more about later on. And then part 5 looks at shaping my borough. So what are the engagement guidelines and best practice to ensure that young people are engaged in shaping the built environment. And then we also, at the kind of sort of part 6, the end of the SPD, look at what how the guidance can be implemented and delivered. So I just wanted to sort of touch on the child-friendly design principles. So when we first started work on the guidance in sort of autumn 2019, we wanted to take the basis of the Hackney Young Futures Commission work and then develop that further to understand what a child-friendly borough means in Hackney. We worked with ZCD architects on a series of engagement events over sort of 3 to 4 months with Hackney's Youth Parliament, and to really develop these design principles further. And this is what the kind of final design principles ended up being that are in the guidance document. So there's 8, and they include shaping my borough, doorstep play, play on the way, streets for people, contact with nature, destinations for all, making spaces young people want to be, and the final one around health and well-being. And I think it's probably important just to say that we had just completed the workshops with young people with the Youth Parliament in February 2020, and then I guess the pandemic hit in March, and I think this particular principle only gained more strength through that, and I think a real focus on ensuring and design principles around ensuring design of outdoor environments support improve physical health and also mental well-being. And I think that really, the kind of impacts of the pandemic really highlighted the importance of that. And then kind of once we developed the principles, we then looked at the design guidelines, so what practical design guidance we can put in place to deliver the principles. And we decided to kind of look at how children in Hackney grow up and experience their neighbourhood, and break these down into 3 kind of key scales. So the guidance document really is focused on the kind of urban design, so from the front door out, as opposed to kind of internal layout. But what we do in the guidance is we have these 3 scales. We have the doorstep, which is around the shared spaces that connect a front door to surrounding streets and public spaces, recognising that this is different for many children and young people. It's not the same across Hackney, and kind of preparing guidance that sort of reflects that. And we look in this at kind of the doorstep guidance around the location of family homes, playable space outside the front door, and the importance of play space, particularly for sort of under 5-year-olds, and the kind of that as being really critical. So that kind of doorstep guidance is set out. The second scale we then look at is around streets, so looking at the network of routes that children and young people and their families use to move between their home and destinations within their neighbourhood. So this includes guidance around playful design, lighting, activity at street level, street design, pavement widths and crossings. And we also include kind of a number of different precedent examples and case studies within each of these scales as well. And then the final scale is destination. So this is anywhere that children and young people want to be and are, and that is focused around include guidance for schools and public spaces, parks. And this guidance really focuses on accessible and varied parks, playgrounds and open spaces. Flexibility in multi-use games areas as well was really important, and that was something that actually came through the work of the Young Futures Commission and then picked up further in the work of with Youth Parliament, and how to make sure that there is that multi-use games areas provide space and play for a variety of ages, as well as girls and boys, and what opportunities there may be to have more flexible sort of multi-use game areas and bring in other activities within them, and also make sure that they're safe through looking at kind of a variety of entrances, for example, rather than one way in and one way out. So that was the kind of elements of the design guidance. And then what we wanted to do was really look at what opportunities there were to make sure that this guidance actually had an impact. And from what we developed was for each of those 3 scales, a child-friendly design checklist. So this is for the street checklist, and this is for each of the checklists look at a series of questions and a scoring kind of matrix to look at making sure that the guidance and the principles set out in the SPD are delivered in terms of reality, in terms of designs and schemes coming forward. We see that the kind of checklist can be used across a variety of scales of designs and planning applications. We did in the guidance have made it mandatory for all applications where there's a child yield of 10 or more for a child-friendly impact assessment to be completed, and that includes this checklist. But it is also the intention that the checklist is used through the design process and as early as possible. So we really encourage kind of design teams and applicants to consider using the checklist from the early stages through the kind of pre-app process as well. And this just kind of reflects that in terms of looking at just reflecting on how the SPD is being used. So as I've kind of mentioned, the checklist and the child-friendly impact assessment is one tool and one way through the planning decisions and major and minor applications. We are also sort of within plan making, preparing a number of area-based plans, so area action plans and supplementary planning documents for key parts of Hackney, and we are very much making sure that we embed the principles and the guidance into those plans, and looking at how we can do more through developing those plans to engage young people in that plan making as well. And then we are also looking at next year working on an update to our statement of community involvement as well, to reflect the sort of best practice and what ways young people can and should be involved in shaping the built environment. And then there's a number of other kind of ways sort of outside and wider than planning in terms of area regeneration projects, estate regeneration schemes, and working with our colleagues in park projects and street scene to kind of raise awareness about this guidance and how to use it and implement it as well. So I think that's it from me. Thank you very much for listening. And I just put my email there, so if there are any questions that anybody would like to ask about the guidance, how it was prepared, what's in it, and how we're using it, do get in touch. Be great. And thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you very much for that. So without further ado, I'll move on to the announcement of the winner for the policy, strategy and design guidance category. And I'm pleased to announce that the winning submission chose by our panel of judges is London Borough of Hackney, Growing Up in Hackney, Child-Friendly Places. And I'll just share with you some of the comments from the judging panel as to why they picked this as their winning entry. So, pioneering nature of this document to explore innovative design approaches to design better streets and places for a key and often overlooked age group is very engaging and innovative urban design storytelling. The Place Streets design discourse is very compelling and creates a better urban design orientated thinking, not just for children, but it has the capacity to create much more engaged communities and spaces generally. The varied design approaches explored through example images, precedents, and exemplars draws the reader into this particular design thinking process. Reviewing the document left us refreshed and inspired to design better streets and play spaces for children and their extended families and communities in general. So, high praise from all judges and a worthy winner. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really delighted to win this award. Just wanted to say a couple of thank yous. I think I mentioned the presentation, we work with ZCD architects on the engagement work with Hackney Youth Parliament. So just want to thank them, and also within the team at Hackney. We worked, so this was a real team effort, and just want to thank Gabby Abadi, who led on the project, Connor Keepock, who was urban designer, and Peter Kelly as well. Yeah, so it really was a very much a team effort. So thank you for those